hiss grew louder, a sibilant rasp that seemed to echo off the unseen walls, sending a shiver down my spine. The air, already thick with the weight of centuries, grew colder, as if a window had been thrown open to a winter storm. The lantern flickered in the sudden chill, its light momentarily extinguished, plunging me into absolute darkness. Blind, disoriented, I stumbled back, my hand instinctively reaching for the ancient stone wall to steady myself. "Michael, you see anything up there?" John's voice, gruff but reassuringly human, echoed from somewhere behind me. John, the voice of reason, the steady hand on the rudder of this godforsaken expedition. He should have stayed in Oxford, safe amidst his dusty tomes and scholarly debates. Safer, at least, than this tomb of whispers and shadows. Just some kind of inscription. I called back, my voice echoing strangely in the darkness. "Can't quite make it out." The lantern sputtered back to life, casting a dim, wavering circle of light that did little to penetrate the oppressive gloom. I stepped closer to the wall, running my hand over the rough-hewn stone, feeling for the inscription, tracing the outline of the serpent with my fingers. The scales, cold and smooth beneath my touch, seemed to writhe beneath my hand, as if the creature itself were stirring from its ancient slumber. "Anything interesting?" John's voice was closer now. I could hear the crunch of his boots on the dry earth, a comforting counterpoint to the insidious hiss that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the inscription. "It's a serpent," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And there's a word beneath it. Shesh." The hiss, louder now, almost a growl, seemed to rise from the darkness ahead, a chorus of whispers weaving themselves into a tapestry of primal fear. The lantern sputtered again, its light dimming, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the catacomb walls. "John," I said, my voice tight with a fear I couldn't quite suppress. "I think we need to get out of here. Now." But it was too late. The ground beneath my feet shuddered, a tremor so slight I might have imagined it, had it not been for the way the lantern swung wildly above, casting frantic shadows that danced like demons unleashed. And then, from the darkness ahead, a pair of eyes, luminous and reptilian, ignited in the gloom. They stared at me, cold and hungry. And in that moment, I knew with a sickening certainty that we weren't alone in the catacombs. "Just the wind, Michael. It's always the wind down here." John's voice, though calm, did little to soothe my jangling nerves. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, the gesture more for his benefit than mine, I suspected. John, ever the pragmatist, the stalwart explorer with nerves of steel. Or maybe he just hid it better than I did. I envied him that. "Right, the wind," I echoed, hating the tremor in my own voice. I adjusted the lantern, its light dancing over the catacomb walls, revealing more of the unsettling carvings that adorned them. Serpents, coiled and intertwined, their scales rendered in meticulous detail, their eyes seeming to follow my every move. Each one a silent sentinel, a guardian of secrets best left undisturbed. Bloody amazing, isn't it? John's voice held a touch of awe now, his usual academic detachment cracking under the weight of the catacombs' oppressive atmosphere. "Think what these carvings must have meant to them. The serpent god, Shesh, protector of the underworld. Or guardian of something worse," I muttered, brushing a hand against the inscription, feeling the cool smoothness of the stone beneath my fingertips. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into something dangerous, something ancient and malevolent that had been slumbering down here for centuries, waiting for unsuspecting fools like us to awaken it. John, ever the optimist, just laughed. "Don't tell me you're going superstitious on me, old man. We're here to document history, not conjure it." He gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze, his eyes twinkling in the lantern light. "Besides, think of the publication. This'll put our names on the map. Cambridge will be begging for us. Cambridge, the promise of tenure, of recognition, of escaping the stifling confines of our small, underfunded department had been the carrot dangling before me for years. It had been the driving force behind this expedition, the reason I'd agreed to lead a team into the depths of this forgotten corner of the world. But now, standing here in the oppressive silence, the weight of the catacombs pressing down on me. A different kind of fear began to take root. The fear of finding something we weren't meant to find. The fear of disturbing something best left undisturbed. The scale felt strangely warm in my gloved hand, its surface smooth and cool despite the heat it radiated. I studied it under the harsh fluorescent lights of our makeshift lab, a sense of unease settling over me like a shroud. It was flawless, perfectly formed, the delicate veins that ran through it pulsing with a faint, ethereal light. James, his usual academic detachment replaced by a childlike wonder, peered at it through his thick spectacles. "Incredible," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "The craftsmanship is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's almost as if it were alive." I finished, my voice tinged with a dread I couldn't quite shake. James, ever the pragmatist, scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Professor. It's just a scale. An exceptionally well-preserved one to be sure, but a scale nonetheless." I wanted to believe him. God knows, I wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a figment of my overactive imagination. But the events of the past few hours, the oppressive atmosphere of the catacombs, the hissing whispers that seemed to follow me even now, all pointed to a truth I wasn't ready to confront. My fingers, as if with a mind of their own, traced the delicate grooves of the scale, the smooth, almost silken texture, sending a shiver down my spine. It felt wrong, all wrong, like handling something sacred, something forbidden. The air in the lab, usually sterile and impersonal, seemed to crackle with a sudden, unseen energy. The silence broken only by the frantic thump of my own pulse. "We need to analyze this," I said, my voice sharper than intended, trying to cling to a semblance of normalcy. "Run some tests. Carbon dating, chemical composition, the whole 9 yards. There has to be a logical explanation." James, his enthusiasm momentarily dampened by my uncharacteristic curtness, nodded eagerly. "Of course, Professor. Right away." He reached for the scale, and for a fleeting moment, our fingers brushed. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air, already thick and heavy, crackled with a force that sent a jolt through my body. The fluorescent lights overhead sputtered and died, plunging the lab into an almost tangible darkness. A wave of dizziness washed over me, the scale slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. I braced myself against the edge of the table, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. What the hell was that? James's voice, usually so controlled, was tight with a fear that mirrored my own. I fumbled for the lantern on the table, my hand shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to light the damn thing. The feeble flame, a pathetic beacon in the encroaching darkness, revealed a sight that froze the blood in my veins. The scale, lying on the floor where it had fallen, was no longer inert. It pulsed with an eerie internal light, the veins that crisscrossed its surface now glowing with an unnatural luminescence. And radiating from it, a cold, viscous smoke was seeping across the floor, twisting and writhing like a living thing. The growl, a deep, visceral sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the university, morphed into a series of hisses and clicks. It was a language I couldn't understand, but felt deep in my bones. My hand trembled, a primal fear, raw and instinctive, seizing me in its grip. James, his face pale in the flickering light of the emergency lamp that had sputtered to life, stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and scientific curiosity. "What was that, Professor?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the cacophony emanating from the scale. "I don't know," I breathed, my voice tight with terror, "but I think we've stumbled onto something. Something we weren't meant to find." The scale pulsed with an internal light, the veins that ran through it glowing brighter now, the hissing growing louder, more insistent. It felt hot, burning my gloved hand. The heat spread up my arm with an alarming speed. I tried to drop it, to fling it away from me, but my hand wouldn't obey. It was as if an invisible force, ancient and powerful, held me in its grip. The air crackled with energy, a tangible presence filling the room, pressing against us like an unwelcome guest. A wave of dizziness hit me, and I swayed, my free hand grasping for the edge of the table. "Professor, are you all right?" James' voice was high-pitched, laced with a panic he couldn't quite mask. I tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come out. The shadows in the corners of the lab, always present but easily ignored, seemed to deepen, to writhe and pulse with a life of their own. I watched in horrified fascination as they began to stretch towards us, long tendril-like fingers of inky blackness reaching out from the depths of the room. "There's something else here," I rasped, my mouth suddenly dry. The words tasted like fear and something else, something metallic and strange. Something old. A cold draft, originating from no discernible source, swept through the room, extinguishing the lantern on the table, and plunging us into an even deeper darkness. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat echoing the growing dread that coiled in my gut. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the hissing and clicking coming from the scale. "No." I fumbled for James' hand, my gloved fingers closing around his wrist. His skin was clammy, cold. He didn't pull away. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling now. He didn't need to elaborate. We both saw it. A form, tall and skeletal, coalescing from the darkness near the door. Its eyes, 2 points of fire in the otherwise impenetrable gloom, fixed on us, and a wave of nausea, powerful and unrelenting, washed over me. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that we weren't alone. The throbbing in my hand intensified, a searing pain that spread like wildfire up my arm. I stumbled back from the shattered remnants of the scale, my stomach churning with a growing sense of dread. The air, thick with the stench of ozone and something else, something ancient and foul, crackled with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Professor," James's voice, usually so steady, wavered with a fear that mirrored my own. He scrambled back from the spreading smoke, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. The shadows in the room, no longer content to lurk at the edges of my vision, twisted and contorted, taking on a life of their own. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, pulsing and writhing in the space where the scale had fallen. And then, it emerged. A figure, impossibly tall and skeletal, rose from the heart of the swirling smoke. Its skin, stretched taut over a framework of bone and sinew, was the color of old parchment, crisscrossed with a network of pulsing veins that glowed with an eerie internal light. Its eyes, 2 burning embers in the gloom, fixed on me, and a wave of primal terror, raw and ancient, crashed over me, stealing my breath and stopping my heart. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there, paralyzed by fear. But my legs felt like lead, my body a stranger to my own will. I could only watch in horrified fascination as the creature took a step towards us, its movements fluid, almost graceful, despite its grotesque form. "What is that?" James whispered, his voice barely audible above the frantic thump of my own pulse. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The creature, its burning gaze never leaving mine, raised a hand. Its skeletal fingers tipped with claws that glinted like obsidian in the dim light. A low growl, deep and guttural, rumbled from its chest, a sound that spoke of unimaginable power and a hunger that knew no bounds. This was no ordinary creature. This was something else, something ancient, something evil, and it had its sights set on me. "Easy there, Professor. Don't try to move too quickly." James hovered at my bedside, his youthful face etched with concern that seemed to belie his usual academic detachment. He handed me a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly as our fingers brushed. "They said you collapsed in the tunnel. Do you remember what happened?" I took a sip of the water, the coolness a welcome contrast to the feverish heat that seemed to radiate from my skin. The memory of the serpent, its scales shimmering in the lantern light, its eyes boring into mine with chilling intelligence, sent a shiver down my spine. The weight of its gaze, heavy with ancient malice, pressed down on me, suffocating me. It was disorienting. I finally said, my voice a dry rasp. The words felt hollow, insufficient, unable to encompass the sheer terror that had gripped me in the depths of the earth. James, ever the pragmatist, nodded, his expression carefully neutral. The paramedics mentioned a possible gas leak. Something about unusual readings in the air quality down there. A gas leak. Right. Because that explained the eyes. The hiss that seemed to slither into my very soul. I wanted to laugh, but the sound died in my throat, choked by the fear that tightened its grip on my chest. It was more than that, James. I insisted, pushing myself up against the pillows, ignoring the dizziness that swam at the edges of my vision. Something down there, it was watching us. I felt it. I know it. James hesitated, his gaze flicking to the bandages that covered my hand, his expression unreadable. Disbelief? Pity? Perhaps a bit of both. Professor, maybe you should rest, he suggested gently, his tone the one he usually reserved for particularly fragile artifacts. You've been working too hard. It's easy to let your imagination run wild in a place like that. Easy for him to say. James, with his tidy world of research grants and peer-reviewed articles, couldn't comprehend the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of things. He hadn't felt the heat of the serpent's gaze, hadn't heard the whispers that clung to the edges of his sanity. But I had. And the memory, sharp and cold as shattered glass, refused to be dismissed. It coiled in the pit of my stomach, a venomous serpent biding its time, waiting to strike. He pulled a worn leather-bound book from his bag, its spine cracked and faded with age. They found this lodged in the tunnel, right where you collapsed. It was a journal, its pages thick and yellowed, the script a spidery hand I couldn't quite place. It's ancient, James murmured, his voice hushed with awe. And the language. He trailed off, his brow furrowed in concentration. It speaks of the serpents, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. Of a ritual. A sacrifice. Something about a chosen one marked by the touch. A cold dread washed over me, settling in my gut like a stone. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the air thickening until it was hard to breathe. The bandage on my hand throbbed, a steady, insistent pulse of pain that mirrored the frantic beat of my heart. James, I croaked, my voice raw with a terror I couldn't conceal. We need to leave, now. He looked up, startled by the urgency in my voice. But before he could answer, the heart monitor beside me let out a shrill, piercing shriek. What the? James jumped to his feet, his eyes darting to the machine as its frantic beeping filled the room. And then, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the shadow surrounding it, slithered across the wall, its form elongated, serpentine. It moved with an unsettling fluidity, its passage leaving a trail of frost on the sterile white paint. James, his back to the wall, didn't see it. Not at first, but he felt the sudden drop in temperature, the way the air crackled with an unnatural energy. Professor, he asked, his voice hesitant, a tremor of fear creeping into his tone. What is it? I didn't answer. I couldn't. My gaze was fixed on the shadow as it stretched across the wall, taking on a more defined shape, the shape of a serpent. Its scales, black as obsidian, glinted in the dim light, and its eyes, two burning embers of pure malice, locked onto mine. It was here, and it wasn't alone. The shadows, no longer content to dance at the periphery, surged forward, engulfing the room in an icy blackness. The heart monitor shrieked its relentless warning, a high-pitched whine that grated against my raw nerves. I could feel the air crackle, the temperature plummeting as the shadows solidified, taking on form and substance. They were here, the serpent on the wall, its scales shimmering like oil on water, uncoiled, its head darting forward with a speed that belied its size. James, his eyes wide with dawning horror, finally turned, his back slamming against the wall as if seeking a solidity that no longer existed. Professor, he gasped, his voice thin and ready, a child's voice lost in the growing darkness. I tried to answer, to warn him, but the words wouldn't come. Fear, cold and sharp as shattered glass, choked me, stealing my breath, my voice, my very will. The serpents, their eyes burning with an ancient, insatiable hunger, slithered towards us, their movements a grotesque parody of grace. The first one struck with the speed of a viper, its fangs sinking into James's outstretched arm. A scream, choked off as quickly as it began, echoed in the sterile confines of the hospital room. I watched in horrified fascination as the serpent's body, impossibly long, wrapped around James, constricting, squeezing the air from his lungs, the life from his eyes. James thrashed, his free hand clawing at the serpent's scales, his eyes meeting mine in a silent plea for a salvation I knew I couldn't offer. It was happening too fast, the shadows swirling, the air thick with the stench of decay, the coppery tang of blood. I lunged, adrenaline momentarily overriding my terror, my good hand closing around the metal A4 stand beside the bed. Heaving with a strength born of desperation, I swung it at the serpent, the metal clanging against its scales with a sound like a gong. The serpent, momentarily distracted, uncoiled from James, its head snapping towards me, its eyes blazing with a cold fury that sent a fresh wave of terror through my veins. I braced myself, waiting for the strike, for the searing pain, the oblivion, but the serpent never reached me. The shadows, as if startled by some unseen cue, receded, melting back into the walls, leaving behind a chilling emptiness that was somehow worse than their presence. The air, still heavy with the stench of decay and the coppery tang of blood, crackled with a fading energy, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. James lay sprawled on the floor, his body a broken doll tossed aside by a careless child. The heart monitor, its frantic beeping silenced, cast an eerie green glow over the scene, its flatline a stark counterpoint to the frantic pounding of my own heart. The world, no longer bound by the laws of physics or sanity, tilted on its axis. I crawled towards James, each movement a monumental effort against the tide of nausea rising in my throat. His eyes, wide and staring, reflected the horror of his final moments. The image seared onto my retinas like a brand. I wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but the only sound that emerged was a strangled sob. The journal, it lay open on the floor, its pages fluttering in the faint breeze from the now closed doorway. The spidery script a stark reminder of the ancient evil we had unearthed. My gaze fell on a single line, its words burning themselves into my brain. The curse is a hunger that can never be sated, a debt that can never be repaid. A cold wave of understanding washed over me, leaving behind a residue of despair that was colder than the grave. This wasn't over. This would never be over. The serpents, the curse, the ancient hunger that pulsed in the depths of that godforsaken temple. It was a part of me now, a shadow cast over my soul. I was marked. I stumbled back from James's body, a strangled cry dying in my throat. The air, still thick with the stench of decay and the lingering musk of the serpents, seemed to press in on me, suffocating me. My gaze darted around the room, searching for a way out, an escape from this nightmare. But the sterile white walls, once a symbol of safety and reason, now felt like the bars of a cage, a holding cell for the madness that was closing in. A cold wave of understanding washed over me, as chilling and final as a grave. The doctors, the nurses, they meant well, but they didn't understand. They hadn't seen what I had seen, hadn't felt the icy breath of the serpents on their skin, hadn't met the gaze of the obsidian god that pulsed in the heart of that forsaken temple. They thought it was over, that I was safe. But the curse, I knew with a sickening certainty, didn't end with a hospital stay. It was a part of me now, a shadow woven into the fabric of my being. I was marked, and then I saw it. A subtle shift in the air, a ripple in the sterile white paint of the wall. It was almost imperceptible, a fleeting trick of the light. But my blood ran cold. I'd seen that same distortion before, in the moments before the creatures materialized from the shadows. A low hiss, barely audible over the hum of the hospital machinery, sent a shiver down my spine. It was coming from the wall, from the very spot where the air seemed to shimmer and distort. The wall bulged, the paint cracking like a spider web, revealing a sliver of darkness beneath. I watched, mesmerized, as the darkness deepened, taking on a familiar, serpentine shape. The obsidian god wasn't finished with me yet.